The next one that comes up is Linux. How do we get Linux to be compliant?
So Linux is probably the hardest topic to cover when it comes to compliance. And of course, we're talking about mostly Linux when it comes to Linux on a workstation. Linux running on a workstation, there's a great feature of one of the later Ubuntu releases that allows you to natively go and connect it to Azure Active Directory. Linux actually may have, at least the Ubuntu release, may have a little bit of a leg up on the Mac OS environment because you can go and attach it natively to your Azure AD environment. Outside of that, policy management for Linux, you have several vendors. You have Red Hat, you have Ubuntu with Ubuntu Pro release that they are starting to bring on board those native tool sets to go and be able to push policy to those end user workstations and things like that. I think you have to ask yourself the same question though that you did with Mac OS of why are my users running Linux in the environment on a workstation? And oftentimes, your users are going to be running Linux for the flexibility that's inherent to Linux. And so I think this is a part where you have to kind of tread carefully in your environment because we don't want to go and hinder these people from going and building your product, building your tool sets by going and deploying policy that hinder that flexibility. But the fact is there are several tools that are there to go do it. But I think we kind of go back to the scoping conversation of, are these devices processing our CUI?
Yep.
And if they're not, to your point, we may scope these out of the compliance boundary or moving those users to using their Linux device day to day and then leveraging that secure enclave in order to process CUI.
One of my first compliance customers, they got a Cyber to go do some machine learning. Mm-hmm. They wanted to do it on a Linux box, and then the whole idea around it was that they were going to process images that ultimately had Russian trucks with big missile on the top, and they had to identify where the truck was in the picture and all that stuff. But when they were in their early learning phases of that, they were just trying to figure out how to use AI, right? They're in that initial dev learning curve portion of it. Yep. And so they're just using a folder filled with cat pictures. Right. So it's cat pictures. It's, we're leveraging the Linux environment for open source and the freedom to get all these cool tools and the tensor from Google and all those type of things. And so we still though had, these two engineers that were working on it. Mm-hmm. The whole rest of the company is not in scope.
Right.
And so there was a point where we're like, okay, well, we're just going to take this high-end workstation. We shoved it into an office. We added a second set of door locks on it. Mm-hmm. We buried it, where it was 2 layers deep inside the office. Yeah. It was put behind a second firewall. It in itself had protection around the Linux box, even though we couldn't back then, there wasn't the Ubuntu distributions like we have today. So, it was just a copy of just generic Ubuntu on it. But we put enough wrapping protection around it, kind of wrapped it with the bubble wrap, so to speak, and said, okay, you can't remotely log into it. You're not VPNing from home to get into it.
Right.
If you need to process these, missile pictures, you're going to sit in this space behind these locked doors and you work on it. And to that point, that was how we were able to help keep the control on that GUI.
Yeah. So the physical manifestation of compartmentalizing and scoping.